Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to the Mythgard Academy. This is session number 3 on the Peoples of Middle-earth, Volume 12 of the History of Middle-earth. And tonight we begin the big, fat second chapter on the appendix on languages. So it's like the Appendix F thing. And it was hard, last time I was like, just kind of read as much as you can, and we'll get through as much as we can next time. The chapter's like 50 pages long. But truth be told, we're unlikely to get much further than like 10 pages in. I think we're going to spend all of our time tonight talking about the first section of that chapter, which is the sort of extra little prologue that Tolkien wrote and which puzzled Christopher. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about Christopher's puzzlement. First, just quick before we get started, I wanted to remind people, I've been talking about this, but I've just been really excited about this. Our Signum tutorials program, this new thing that we're doing at Signum. It's been so cool because lately I have been seeing, we have a bunch of students who have already begun now already, and I have had such a wonderful time getting to see some of the projects and things that people are doing in the Signum tutorials projects. It is so cool. There's somebody who is going to be doing one of our language classes in space, but the language class is only running every other month, and so in the months in between, they're going to do a tutorial with one of our preceptors to like sort of build on and practice the language so that they can kind of accelerate their development of the language as they go through. Really, really cool idea. There's a project that involves someone who's doing a translation. So they're translating something from another language, but their native English speaker who has been living in the other country for so long that they're like less than 100% confident that their English idioms are going to be exactly right. So they're going to be working with one of our preceptors on, who's going to be, working through with them with their English. They haven't used like, American like MLA citation format and stuff like that for a really, really long time. So just kind of helping them to go through with the work that they're doing, and also some research involved with the translation as well. It's just so much fun to be seeing how we're already working in our Signum tutorials program to come alongside people who are doing really, who just want to learn and want to develop their own individualized learning plan, people who have really cool projects that they're working on that they are interested to move forward with and to get some guidance with, and kind of mentoring and direction as they go through. This is it's such an exciting way to apply academic resources, the kind of resources that we have at Signum, and to be able to help people, in these kinds of individualized ways. It's just super, super exciting. So if there is something that you think, again, whether it's help with a big project or help with a small project, or I get some kind of learning project that you want to do or research that you'd love help with, or whatever it is, reach out to us. Go to blackberry.signumuniversity.org, click on here at Signum Tutorials, and then you will see the student interest form. That's the key thing right there. Click on the student interest form and let us know what you're thinking about, and we will be in touch, and you can meet with our folks, and we can help to get things sorted out there. Anyway, yeah, so you can see lots of things going on. Academic writing, research, and scholarly publishing tutorials. That's one of the things that I was just looking at. Language learning and philology tutorials. That was one of the others. So cool. So much fun stuff going on. Anyhow, just wanted to kind of share with you some of the excitement that I am seeing happening at Signum Tutorials. And I hope that some of you might be interested. There's no like commitment or anything with the student interest form. If you're not sure whether or not the project that you have in mind is something that would fit with what, we're able to help with and offer, ask and see. We'll let you know. If we don't think we can help with that, we'll let you know, or whatever. But anyway, so Signum Tutorials, such a fun new program. I'm really excited about it. All right. I'm also excited to get into our discussion of this prologue today. So there are a couple things here. First of all, what let me share two kind of sort of personal framework things from like from me personally about my own interests and my own abilities, I guess. First, I want to explain what I find so exciting about the history of Middle-earth in general, and especially when Christopher is really not just kind of talking in general about the development of ideas and stuff, or doing a kind of a survey of a longer piece, like back, in the Morgoth's Ring and stuff, when he's like, and here, like, the annals of Aman become the gray annals, and here are the 4 paragraphs that are different between this draft and that. Like, some of that's, I mean, there are really interesting nuggets kind of embedded in that. But the stuff that really excites me is when we're getting a clearer window into how Tolkien's creative process works, like to be able to follow his mind, and sometimes, of course, like, it's not that any of this makes his mind perfectly transparent to us, of course, but there are ways in which we can really see how he's progressing. It's like, I've talked about this before in other contexts, of course, in the history of Middle-earth, but I love it when we can see evidence not of what Tolkien was doing when he was drafting stuff, but what he thought he was doing. How he pictured this project that he was doing. You may remember, those of you who have been either listening to back catalogs or have been with me here for a very long time will remember back in, what was it? The Lost Road, I think it was, when we were looking at the 1937 Quenta Silmarillion material. That it was really exciting to go through and see what he thought, because he was preparing the Silmarillion. He thought he was preparing the Silmarillion. He hoped he was preparing the Silmarillion for publication at that point. And so to see then what he thought the Silmarillion was, right? What he thought he was doing when he was bringing that together. I find this piece that Christopher gives us at the beginning of chapter 2 here, this kind of additional prologue-y thing that Christopher doesn't really know what to do with. I love it. I love it, and I love what we can learn from it. So through this and throughout, I'm not just going to be, like throughout the rest of this chapter and everything as well, I'm not just going to be looking like, let's compare to Appendix F, right? Because it's, ultimately we're getting, the growth to Appendix F. What I'm really interested in are the steps along the way. How did Tolkien come to the point where he's writing Appendix F? Just as we were looking at the sort of the development, the evolution of the prologue last time. And learning what we can see of Tolkien, like when did Tolkien come up with certain things, right? How is he thinking about this stuff? What can we learn about that stuff? Anyway, so that's what I'm going to, so there may be times, one thing that this means you need to be patient with me about. There will be times when I'm going to be kind of playing dumb. That is to say, like, I'm not going to be bouncing back and forth between this prologue and like the published Appendix F and being like, this stuff is right there in Appendix F. I'm going to be kind of taking it. So I want to read this thing as if we're reading it as Tolkien presented it, or thought of presenting it, right? Didn't even end up presenting it, but the way that Tolkien conceived of it, right? To try to receive it as he was initially intending to present it. To see what it is and to see what it tells us. And yep, there will be things that like he's going to change later, or things that will, be connections that we'll make later on and all that sort of thing. But that's not what I'm going to focus on today. I want to focus on that prologue, the first section of chapter 2, that prologue-y bit, as I've been calling it, and see what Tolkien gives us there and what we learn from it. And I think it's pretty interesting. The second personal comment that I want to make is I want to remind everybody, I've said this many times before, and I think that many people don't believe me when I say it, but I really want you to believe me when I say this. I am not an expert in Tolkien's languages. I am vastly ignorant about a lot of Tolkien's languages. This is something I have always considered to be one of my greatest deficiencies, as a learner and teacher about Tolkien. Deficiency not like it just in stuff that I've learned, but in like I don't love the languages. It's like, that's my confession. That's like my dark confession, is I don't love the languages. It's not that I hate them, and it's not that I know nothing about them. And I care about them, especially as Tolkien presents them in the story. I've just never been somebody who has been motivated to like spend a lot of I never, like as a teenager reading it or whatever, I never spent a lot of my time like poring over, like the Quenya stuff. I just never taught myself the language. Like I only learned how to write in Tengwar just a couple of years ago. I learned that at Textmoot a couple of years back. So like, it's never been my thing. It's never been my thing. I've always loved the stories and this, but I have never been in love with the languages. So I am on weak ground when I'm talking about the languages. So chapters like this always make me a little bit uneasy, just because, I don't want to kind of pretend to more familiarity than I have with stuff. So anyway, as I said, I've made this confession before. I just wanted to repeat it before we start talking about the appendix on language. But here's the advantage. For those of you, and I know there are many of you who are listening who know Tolkien's languages really well, probably better than I do, right? To you, I just ask your indulgence, because I'm gonna... All right, I was about to say again, play dumb. That's not exactly what I mean, but I am going to be kind of taking a relatively simplistic approach in many cases, and I'm going to because here's the advantage. Here's the advantage of the fact that I'm not an expert at Tolkien's languages, and that is I am, because I know there are many other Tolkien fans who don't know his languages really well. So if you're one of those people, like me, then I can be a helpful guide to you, because I don't know much more than you do, and we will learn together what is to be learned and seen, and sometimes it's easier to learn things that way. So anyway, that is, yeah, I know. It's being accused of blasphemy and being a fake fan. I know. Totally guilty. And I've always said that Tolkien himself would doubtless be very disappointed in me. Like, sometimes people have asked me, like, what do you think Tolkien would think of your podcast if he heard it? And I've always said, well, he'd be pretty disappointed at how little time I spend on his languages. So, like, that's anyway, that's like the way it is. Okay. So, with those preambles, let's get into the text and see if we can get through this initial prologue bit. That is my aspiration, to get through like the first 10 pages of this chapter. Let's see how we do. All right. Christopher begins by stating his puzzlement. He says, beside the foreword concerning hobbits, whose development, clear and coherent, into the prologue has been described in the last chapter, there is another text of a prefatory or introductory nature, and it is not easy to see how my father designed it to relate to the foreword concerning hobbits. Indeed, except in one point, they have nothing in common, for this further text, which has no title, is scarcely concerned with hobbits at all. For a reason that will soon be apparent, I give it here in full. Okay. So I want to be really careful here, because I am frankly a little bit puzzled by Christopher's puzzlement, which always makes me nervous. Like whenever Christopher says, as he does very often, because, he tends to take a fairly humble posture towards these things. When Christopher says things like, I don't understand this at all, and I'm reading it and I'm like, seems to make perfect sense to me, it makes me nervous, right? I'm like, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm oversimplifying or whatever. But of course, Christopher's quite right to say that this second text is scarcely concerned with hobbits at all. That's absolutely true. And so therefore, in subject matter, that is like in the things they discuss, there's little clear coherence between the forward concerning hobbits. But I think if we look at this from a different perspective, it's fairly clear to see, I think, what the relationship is between those two. The relationship is not to be found in the subject matter under discussion. It is to be found in the voice of the person who is doing the discussion. What both of these texts seem to me to manifestly have in common is the point of view of the speaker. That is to say, in both cases, the fictitious persona that Tolkien adopts in both cases of the modern researcher who has discovered the ancient texts, derived ultimately from the Red Book of Westmarch through other sources, and who is here presenting that material to us. The narrative voice of the forward concerning hobbits, aka the prologue, is consistently that voice. It is the voice of a modern scholar who is pretending he did not compose this text, but discovered it and translated it. And so in Concerning Hobbits, that modern scholar, editor person is giving us background on the material, right? On, hobbits and their, and he's particularly interested in hobbits, not just because they are the sort of the protagonists of the story, but also because they are the origin of the text, right? Just like if you discovered, and were introducing people to a new text in even an obscure language that was known, like Gothic or something like that. Like, say you discovered a manuscript in the Gothic language that had never been known before, and you were presenting a translation of it. Well, one of the things you would do if you were writing a scholarly prologue to that would be to give some historical context, right? We can place this manuscript within this particular era, and let's talk about it and its relationship to other Gothic texts, and that's the kind of thing you would do, right? What else would you do in a scholarly introduction to a translation or edition of that kind? Well, you'd talk about your methodology, wouldn't you? You would be like, so in approaching the translation of this text, I had to make certain choices, and this is the kind of thing I would do. That's what he's doing. That seems to me quite obviously what this second untitled prologue-y thing is doing, right? We're going to read it through. In fact, it will not surprise you to hear, I want to read the whole thing. I went through, at first I was trying to pick especially interesting paragraphs, but then every time I did, I looked at the paragraph that I skipped, and I'm like, but I want to talk about that, so forget it. We're talking about the whole thing, and it's short anyway. So we're going to talk about the whole thing, and I think that we will be able to see this emerge. This is clearly, especially at the start, written as another part of that kind of scholarly apparatus. Again, the thing that they have in common is that in both cases, it's the scholar, editor, translator speaking to us, the modern reader, in order to explain and contextualize the choices made in presenting to us this text. Okay. And if I could make one, and here's the cheekiest thing, if I could tweak Christopher just a tiny bit, it seems to me a little bit ironic that he seems to be overlooking that. Not that he wasn't aware of it. Like, I'm not saying he was, that like what I've said about the sort of narrative voice of the prologue was like unknown to Christopher, that he didn't know. But I've said before, indeed, we ended our discussion last time with that reference to the frame of the Silmarillion, which Tolkien and of course to Christopher's choice, understandable as it is, to remove the frame from the Silmarillion, which I think was the biggest and most impactful editorial choice that he made when when putting together and publishing the Silmarillion materials. And so it's a little bit ironic to me that if Christopher is kind of, if he's a little bit deaf to the thing that connects these two things. A little ironic to me that it's because what he's being deaf to is the frame, right? Like the fact that Tolkien is presenting what connects them. The thing Christopher's not seeing is the frame, right? That we have a story, The Lord of the Rings, and there's a frame around that story, which is the Red Book of Westmarch frame, right? Like the Hobbit textual history, Shire, Gondor textual history, right? Of the story that we read. But the prologue adds a frame around that, which is the frame of the modern scholar translator who discovered the thing, translated it, and has edited it for us, right? So there's the 2-layer frame that Tolkien has clearly established in The Lord of the Rings. And so again, it seems a little ironic to me that Christopher, that's, of all things, that's the thing that he's kind of, seems to me to be missing here. And Fencing Frog, I am sure, he says maybe it's a case of being a little too close to the source material. I don't doubt it. And we'll come back a little bit later to Christopher's assessment. This is like what he writes before he gives us the text of the little prologue thing. And we'll come to what Christopher says, like his assessment immediately after he ends presenting the text to us. And we'll see a little bit more, I think, Fencing Frog, that kind of relates towards the end there, that kind of relates to this too. Now, Jocelyn, this is a great question. Why is he bothering, Tolkien that is, with the frame around the frame anyway? It's not like it was shameful to write novels in his day. I agree. It isn't that he had to hide it, like that he was trying to pretend. I don't think Tolkien is earnestly attempting to pretend. I don't think he's trying to deceive us, right, into thinking that he didn't, like he's actually trying to distance himself from it. I don't think that he is. I think I agree with Fencing Frog's reply there. I think that he just really enjoyed it. I think it was fun and funny. Like he was amused by this. We can see this. I mean, remember the Notion Club papers, right? He loves this kind of thing. Lewis did too. Remember C.S. Lewis's fake scholarly commentary on the Lay of Lathian, right? When he made his comments, like they dug this. Like this was their world. The world of scholarship and editing and translations and stuff, that he would couch his fictional thing in a fake and slightly satirical send up of that. I think the satire is clear in places in the prologue. I think that it's a kind of humor that he can't resist, that he just loves. Green Crate Dragon, exactly. They're nerds. That's yeah. He was a nerd. He was a nerd and a geek. And there it is. Like it's so, yeah, I think it just, and I know that seems in some ways like an unsatisfactory answer, that I think he did it just because he enjoyed it. But I kind of think that is the answer. And Fanaro, I agree with you. Fanaro's Pizza says Tolkien took the approach that he discovered the world more than he created it. It is true that this sort of semi-satirical, kind of self-deprecatingly amusing tone that he takes, because again, the persona that is a slightly bumbling persona, kind of over earnest and sometimes kind of you were kind of invited to laugh at it in the prologue, especially, I think. But anyhow, you were right that the fiction that he discovered these texts and is only translating them and not making them up, that does parallel his earnest descriptions of his actual creative process, this process of discovery rather than invention. And I do think that that's another reason why this kind of appealed to him. I don't think that he is trying to point to. The frame isn't like earnestly pointing to that process, but as I say, they're parallel. And I think that that's not an accident. I think that he found that the fictional frame of the, I just discovered it and I'm translating it. I think it's one of the reasons why he finds that a particularly appealing kind of frame, because it does fit with his actual kind of convictions about his own process in that way. In First Fish, you're right. Many authors have spoken of a similar sort of thing. In fact, it's sort of to the point where I'm not sure great books are ever written in any other way, frankly. But anyway, yeah. So, but anyway, so let's move forward and look at his actual thing. Okay, here we go. First few paragraphs. This tale is drawn from the memoirs of Bilbo and Frodo Baggins, preserved for the most part in the Great Red Book of Samwise. It has been written. I love how the Book of Samwise sounds like it's not. If read out of context, Samwise could sound like maybe a place name or, anyway, like the "of" in that phrase doesn't sound like a mere of possession. Right at first, like it's like the Great Book of Samwise. It's like, is there a lot of Samwise in it? Right, like the I remember I had a book when I was like 7 called The Big Book of Amazing Facts. It was just like a bunch of information about things, and it kind of sounds like that, right? It's a great red book it's full of Samwise. There's a lot of Samwise in that book, right? Anyway, sorry, that phrasing just strikes me as funny. Okay, preserved for the most part in the Great Red Book of Samwise. It has been written during many years for those who were interested in the account of the great adventure of Bilbo, and especially for my friends, the Inklings, in whose veins I suspect a good deal of hobbit blood still runs, and for my sons and daughter. But since my children and others of their age who first heard of the finding of the ring have grown older with the years, this tale speaks more clearly of those darker things which lurked only on the borders of the other tale, but which have troubled the world in all its history. To the Inklings I dedicate this book, since they have already endured it with patience, my only reason for supposing that they have a hobbit strain in their venerable ancestry. Otherwise it would be hard to account for their interest in the history and geography of those long-past days, between the end of the dominion of the elves and the beginning of the dominion of men, when for a brief time the hobbits played a supreme part in the movements of the world. Right, Jackie is LOLing about endured it with patience. Right, Jackie, one does feel one needs to add some more patience, with more patience than others. Right, there were certain of the Inklings, Dyson very famously, who did not endure the Lord of the Rings with very great patience. But others, of course, like C.S. Lewis, with a great deal of patience. Okay, anyway, now, one thing to notice. You might be saying here, wait a second, isn't he talking about writing it here? Like when he says things like, it has been written during many years? Like, didn't he just claim to be writing it? How is this a frame in that way? Well, we'll see how he will talk about that sort of thing more. But, spoiler, at the end, we're going to get a quotation from him. One of the reasons that he wanted to remove this, and wanted to remove also the comment is related specifically to the foreword of the first edition of The Lord of the Rings, where he talks about basically mixing things. He said that in the foreword to the first edition of The Lord of the Rings, he was guilty of mixing basically the frame and real biographical history, right, of the writing, of the process of writing the book. And we can see that happening here too. He is on the one hand, I mean, again, this tale is drawn from the memoirs of Bilbo and Frodo, preserved for the most part in the Great Red Book. So in sentence 1, he's saying, I didn't write it, I drew it from their memoirs. And very likely he only means it has been written during many years, meaning like, the translation has been done the work of it has been done. But again, he is kind of breaking the frame there, because if you were a scholar actually talking about an edition that you had made or a translation you had done, you would very rarely talk like that. Like, it has been written during many years. It's just not usually the phrasing you would use. You would say, like, the work went on for many years, or whatever. But anyway, so he does seem to be kind of at least risking breaking the frame here, I think. And the same in the paragraph too. Same thing with the reference to his children. And how the tone of the tale changed over the years. Like, presumably, if you're, like, just translating, the text is fixed and not going to evolve, right, over the years. So again, there are things that we can see in these early paragraphs where he's kind of skirting, kind of doing a little bit of both, where he's not really clearly settled in between the scholarly frame and the personal reflections of the author here. Lines are definitely blurred a little bit here, Maureen, I think. We can still see the evidence of the frame's presence. And as I say, that will become more clear. The Inklings thing, too. Like, they've already endured it with patience. Again, that could be done with a translation. In fact, that was the kind of thing that would be read to the Inklings. But still, it at least runs the risk of blurring the lines there also a little bit. By the way, I also just love that phrase. When for a brief time, the hobbits played a supreme part in the movements of the world. A supreme part, huh? That's kind of fun. Notice, by the way, how he characterizes the shift of the tone. On the one hand, he hints at the fact that The Hobbit was written for children, but The Lord of the Rings is written for grown-ups, right? Referencing his children and others of their age, right? I mean, his reference to The Hobbit there is extremely oblique. Since my children and others of their age who first heard of the finding of the ring have grown older with the years. So yes, they first heard of the finding of the ring in The Hobbit, right? So but it's very indirect. So he's very obliquely in this second paragraph, which is all one sentence, describing how the tone is acknowledging the difference in tone from The Hobbit to The Lord of the Rings. But notice how he characterizes it. This tale speaks more clearly of those darker things, which lurked only on the borders of the other tale, but which have troubled the world in all its history. That is, he is emphasizing that if this story differs from The Hobbit, it's because The Hobbit was suppressing the darker things, not because darker things have been infused into this story. So he, and we'll see this in another place too later on, when he is making a distinction, this kind of distinction, he's always doing it in a sense at the expense of The Hobbit. It's not that this tale has grown up. It's that the Hobbit story was younged down, right? Yeah. Anyway, so that's just kind of a little interesting thing embedded there. But let's keep going, because I believe in going really fast through these things. For the Inklings I add this note, since they are men of lore, and curious in such matters. It is said that hobbits speak a language or languages very similar to ours, but that must not be misunderstood. Their language was like ours in manner and spirit. But if the face of the world has changed greatly since those days, so also has every detail of speech, and even the letters and scripts then used have long been forgotten and new ones invented. No doubt for the historians and philologists, it would have been desirable to preserve the original tongues, and certainly something of the idiom and the humour of the hobbits is lost in translation, even into a language as similar in mood as is our own. But the study of the languages of those days requires time and labour, which no one but myself would, I think, be prepared to give to it. So I have, except for a few phrases and inscriptions, transferred the whole linguistic setting into the tongues of our own time. Okay. Yeah, I know Graham Young doesn't really work as a verb, but anyway, just trying to hope you got the general impression. Anyway, now notice here that see how much clearer the frame is here. Right, here is him talking about how, like, this is, he begins here with a justification for why I translated it at all, instead of merely presenting a modern edition of this book in the original Westron. Right, doubtless for historians and philologists, they would have much better appreciated this story if it all in Westron without the translation. And I realize that many parts of the story suffer from the fact that they've been translated. And you notice what he's apologizing for? The idiom and humor of the hobbits. If, it turns out that you all don't like the hobbitry stuff, like if you don't think hobbits are as funny as I do, then, blame it on the translation, right? So that's kind of a funny little point. But anyway, he's very clear about the fact here that he's not writing this, right? This is not his creation. He's just translated this whole thing. So again, right away here, as soon as he finishes that little introduction, when he gets into the meat of the matter he was going to discuss, this note, right, that he's going on to make, that he was been introducing for the first 3 paragraphs, we can see clearly the frame, that's modern scholar frame that he has established. Now, there are several really interesting notes that I would make here. I love, but I don't pretend to understand, because I don't understand it much at all. His sentence. So he says, the hobbits spoke a language very similar to ours. So if we just stopped there, what are we thinking? What does he mean by that? The hobbits spoke a language very similar to ours. So he's like, like, French, maybe? Or, like, German? Or like, Old English or something? Like Frisian? Yeah, exactly. Is it like, how is it very similar to ours? But he immediately says, that must not be misunderstood. Don't be thinking etymologically, because that's not what I mean. I don't mean that they spoke a language which is like a cousin language to ours. Instead, he says, and this is the sentence I don't understand, their language was like ours in manner and spirit. Now, I don't mean I don't comprehend what he's saying. I mean I can't relate to it. Like, their language was like ours in manner and spirit is a sentence that was written by somebody who understands language in general just far, far better than I ever will. So I don't know languages well enough to be able to learn a language and be able to identify the spirit of that language and to say, what this language is. I mean, I can find similarities between languages, but they'd be fairly mechanical, right? That is, any similarities that I pointed to would be fairly mechanical. Like, if I found another language that used like verb voices the way that Greek does, I'd probably notice, right? And be like, oh, hey, they do like cool stuff with like passive and middle voices, just like Greek does. But does that mean that those two languages are similar in manner and spirit? Well, I just don't really know. At Two Juice Man, I kind of do think that to say like the vibes in these languages are kind of similar is actually, I think, a fair kind of paraphrase of what he's saying. But but in any case, so Fencing Frog, I don't think so. Fencing Frog asks, does language in this case maybe mean culture? Culture's related, certainly, but not. And of course, I can see what you're thinking about the connection between Hobbit culture and English culture, right? But I don't. It's certainly not just that. Now, Tolkien might argue that if you have two languages that are similar in manner and spirit, then very likely you will also find two cultures that are similar to each other, that are harmonious in certain ways. I bet you he would probably say that's at least likely to happen, but it's certainly not only what he means. He is talking about, I believe that Tolkien had a kind of, it's like his phonoaesthetic sense, right? I mean, he is so good at hearing the aesthetics of sound. He just had a sense for like the vibe and spirit and feeling of a language. And he could just tell you like, yeah, these two languages, they're not closely connected etymologically, right? They don't sound or look much alike, but they have a similar kind of spirit. They're like I don't know what, approach to things is sort of similar. Exactly, Jackie. He got inside language, which is a very true thing, said of Tolkien. And so, like I said, I can't, I mean, I think I know Tolkien well enough to know what he means by this. I just don't know language well enough to be able to nod sagely and be like, oh, yes, Tolkien, I know exactly what you mean by that. I don't know what he means by that. I've never experienced it. But I believe him. I believe him. And I think, in any case, it is fascinating that that's how he thought about it, right? That this is where he wanted to begin, right? I'm not going to tell you anything about the etymology. You'd think he might indulge himself and be like, so Westron, I mean, he's going to talk about the etymology of Westron to some extent later, but like, I mean, connecting it with the, like, how does it relate to Proto-Indo-European though? Right? He doesn't he doesn't make up anything about that, which he could do. He might do, right? Like some might even expect him to do it, but that isn't where he goes, right? Instead, he immediately goes to this more abstract, more kind of squishy, but in a sense deeper sense of kinship between our two languages. And I think that's, it's just fascinating that he does that. So notice, if the face of the world has changed greatly since those days, so also has every detail of speech. Even the letters and scripts then used have long been forgotten and new ones invented. It's like he's implying that there is no connection with the languages of those days in Proto-Indo-European, that all modern languages have grown up totally independently of the languages of those days. He doesn't state that explicitly, but again, I take him when he says the face of the world has changed greatly, so also has every detail of speech. I think that that's what he's suggesting. That because, of course, the letters and scripts of even, like ancient Mesopotamian languages haven't been utterly forgotten in the sense that we have discovered, cuneiform tablets and stuff like that. Like, well, we don't speak them anymore, right? But they've not been forgotten. Anyway, so the thing that he seems to be doing in the second half of that paragraph is to sort of like don't expect even from a philologist a philological explanation, right? Of where the languages came from. So then he explains his methodology. He begins explaining his methodology, right? So sorry, not going to just represent the original language. I'm going to translate even at a risk. And that sentence in the middle of this second paragraph, the fifth paragraph, right? So cool, right? But the study of the languages of those days requires time and labor, which no one but myself would, I think, be prepared to give to it. That turns out to be untrue, Tolkien, and I think he would have been delighted to discover that there are in fact many people, of whom, as I have confessed, sadly, I am not one, who delight, in fact, in the time and labor required, and who have given very, very much time to the study of the languages of those days. I am sure he would love that fact. However, pay attention to, although he begins, so he kind of points in two contradictory directions in this moment when he is first introducing the linguistic situation of his books, of the Lord of the Rings itself, right? He does two things at the same time. On the one hand, he acknowledges that some people, scholars, right, would like to see the original languages. Most people, in fact, probably nobody but himself, is really interested enough to learn these languages. So the question of how interested are my readers in the languages is something that he's like feeling out a little bit, right? He lays both scenarios where, like, there might be people who would love to see the original languages, but, probably nobody but me really cares. Maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle. And I think it's pretty clear that Tolkien hopes that the truth is somewhere in the middle between those two things, or closer to the desire for languages than on the other side, right? And so we will see the places where throughout this, as he's going to go on to discuss the languages, he is obviously not only trying to satisfy whatever, passing and superficial curiosity his readers might have in this sort of thing, but I think he's also clearly trying to excite interest in his languages, though he's started off with a kind of a lowering of expectations, right? Readers and his own, which I think is really fun. Karina Larsdottir, he doesn't fully invent Westron. We don't get a lot of Westron. Westron is kind of theoretical in a lot of ways, but so I've, except for a few phrases and inscriptions, transferred the whole linguistic setting into the tongues of our time. And now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the methodology there and how I did that. The common speech of the West in those days I have represented by English. This noble tongue has spread in the course of time from the kingdoms. Now, did you make the same mistake I made when I first read this? This noble tongue has spread. He's talking about English, right? Oh, no. He's talking about the common speech of my mistake, right? I don't know if that was intended. Remember, Christopher said that this is written in one draft, and he's, he hasn't gone back and revised this. So that might just be he might not have intended that. But I think it's kind of funny anyway. Maybe he did think that English was a noble tongue, but that's not the noble tongue in question. The common speech is the noble tongue. Yeah, so the common speech of the West I have represented by English. Yes, Karina, that's what he's saying here, that he's, when you are reading modern English in The Lord of the Rings, what you are reading is the common speech of the West. But he needs to explain what the common speech of the West is. This noble tongue had spread in the course of time from the kingdoms of Fornost and Gondor, and the hobbits preserved no memory of any other speech, but they used it in their own manner, in their daily affairs, very much as we use English, though they had always at command a richer and more formal language when occasion required, or when they had dealings with the other people. This more formal and archaic style was still the normal use in the realm of Gondor, as they discovered, and among the great in the world outside the Shire. Okay, so, first of all, note that he's making essentially another parallel with English, right? Because it is possible for us in modern English, us modern English speakers, to modulate, right? And use more archaic speech. If it doth not offend thine ear, I might, mayhap, utilize a more formalized archaic speech, such as was used in days of old. So that's available to me, right? But we don't talk that way normally. But if I were to go to a place where they talked like that, I'd understand them. And I could, though I might make mistakes, talk back to them that way, right? And of course, that's what happens with Pippin, right? He makes mistakes, and so they think he's a prince. But that's so basically the equivalent in Gondor, they speak the equivalent of something like, maybe not all the way Elizabethan English, but something closer to Elizabethan English than we do. I think Elizabethan is a fair estimation. So again, he's appealing to something which is something that English speakers are aware of, right? Like if you've ever been to a Shakespeare play, you're aware of the fact, right, that our language has, that there was a more formal and archaic style, and that some still use, right? Which some still use. I remember once being startled as a child when one of my uncles was visiting us, and he was saying grace before dinner, but when he was praying aloud, he used thee and thou, which of course he never normally did in his common speech. And as a kid, I mean, I was like 6 at the time. I was like, whoa, what just happened? Right. And I followed it. Like, it's not like I didn't understand what he was saying, but I was like, far out, right? Crazy, right? That was interesting. And it was just a modulation, and it was a contextual modulation. He only spoke that way when he was praying. But whenever he prayed, he spoke that way. And I was fascinated by that by the fact of that modulation, when I was a kid. And so again, so the hobbits can do that. They can code switch at times, but it involves code switching. And so again, but notice also what this prepares for, right? This also prepares for the fact that some of the people in the book that you're about to read aren't going to use modern English idioms. In fact, when you hear Theoden and Denethor and even Faramir speak, they're not going to sound like your average bloke on the street in the West Midlands. They're going to sound different. You might detect a more formal and archaic style at some points in this narrative. Do not be alarmed, gentle readers, right? Is kind of one of the subtexts, you see, of this thing. And again, but notice how this is so cool. The Lord of the Rings, the point of view of the Lord of the Rings is from the Hobbit's perspective, right? So we as readers, when we read the Lord of the Rings, we are kind of seeing the world through the Hobbit's eyes. And here in this prologue, he's doing the same thing, where he's saying, like, if some of the speech in this book strikes you as strange, well, that's okay. It would have stricken the hobbits as strange too. You're not only seeing with their eyes, you're hearing with their ears as well. Anyhow, so yes, that is, it's fascinating how he's laying the foundation there, right? But all within the frame, right? All within his theoretical frame. But okay, now it gets weird. Are you ready? But there were other languages in the lands. There were the tongues of the elves. 3 are here met with. The most ancient of all, the High Elven, which they used in secret as their own common speech and as the language of lore and song. The Noldorin, which may be called Gnomish, the language of the exiles from Elvenhome in the far west, to which tongue belong most of the names in this history that have been preserved without translation. And the language of the woodland elves, the elves of Middle-earth. All these tongues were related, but those spoken in Middle-earth, whether by exiles or by elves that had remained here from the beginning, were much changed. Only in Gondor was the Elvish speech known commonly to men. Okay, so what languages is he referring to here? Let's do an exercise. Forget the names. Forget the proper nouns that he gives to the names, to the languages. Let's just read the descriptions instead. 3 are here met with. The most ancient of all was used in secret as the elves' own common speech and as the language of lore and song. Okay, used in secret, language of lore and song. What are we talking about? That's Quenya, right? Language of lore and song, used in secret, for reasons. Quenya. Okay, we're talking about Quenya. Second language, which may be called the second language, to which tongue, the language of the exiles from Elvenhome in the far west. To which tongue belong most of the names in this history that have been preserved without translation? Sindarin, right? Certainly it is to Sindarin to which belong most of the names in this history that have been preserved without translation, right? You know, words like Gondor and Mordor, you know, but most of them, right? Okay, so the first one we know as Quenya. The second one we know as Sindarin, though the language of the exiles from Elvenhome in the far west? I know, James, right? Like, that's really confusing. Not even to mention how confusing the names are, right? But he calls the language, which in its description is clearly Sindarin, the language of the exiles from Elvenhome in the far west. Okay. Third language. The language of the woodland elves, the elves of Middle-earth. Sylvan, right? Legolas's language, right? Which he can speak with the Galadhrim, right? He and Haldir speak in that language. And it's different from Sindarin, as Legolas himself explains to us, right? So, he appears to be describing Quenya, what we know as Quenya, Sindarin, and Sylvan. That's what he seems to be describing. He calls the first one High Elven. He calls the second Noldorin or Gnomish. So just in case we were like, if you were like me now, so one message I'm trying to convey here, if you were confused by this paragraph, so am I. We can all be confused together because I'm confused. I'm confused. And this seems to me to suggest pretty clearly that Tolkien was here in the midst of a significant shift in how he's thinking about these languages. Because the language he's describing as language 2 is obviously Sindarin, the tongue to which belong most of the names in this history that have been preserved without translation. Right? Almost all of the names that end in a consonant are Sindarin, which is most of them, right? So that's obviously Sindarin. But he calls Sindarin the language of the exiles from Elvenhome in the far west, who were the Noldor. And that seems clearly confirmed by the fact that he names the language Noldorin, or Gnomish. James says maybe Sindarin is from the far west if you're from Rune or something. No, he's connecting it with the Noldor. It's the language of the Noldor, he tells us. That's why it's called Noldorin. Duh. Instead of Sindarin. It's not the language of the Sindar at all. It's the language of the Noldor. Okay. So what was the first language again then? High Elven, which they, the High Elves, presumably, used in secret as their own common speech and as the language of Loren's song. In fact, do you see what this seems to map onto? The three kindreds, right? The High Elves. Who are the High Elves? The Vanyar are the High Elves. Like, remember in The Hobbit, that famous paragraph where like he like sort of squeezes the Silmarillion into one paragraph of The Hobbit, where he talks about the High Elves and the Deep Elves and the Light Elves. No, the Light Elves. I always screw this up. The Light Elves, the Deep Elves, and the Sea Elves. He also changed it, and I get it confused. Anyway, the High Elves are the Vanyar. So we've got the Vanyar, the Noldor, and the Teleri, which seem to map onto these three language groups. David Michael Roberts asking, is this all part of the playing dumb process? Kind of, yes. That is to say, like, I am trying to understand this prologue on its own grounds here, and how he's presenting it, what he seems to be saying here, and how we place this, how we understand this. We have already seen in reading the rest of the history of Middle-earth how many things about how the Silmarillion story itself was growing, and how his concept of the languages and how that fits in was changing over time. What I'm looking at here is what I did first was what I think most readers are going to do. Certainly what I did first, again, I'm not being dishonest about that, is be like, wait a second, which one of these is supposed to be, like, I know Quenya and Sindarin, right? I'm not sure which one Gnomish is, and I'm not sure about High Elven either, right? And now I'm even more confused, right? So what we get here, and that's exactly the point, David Michael, you have to forget the Silmarillion wholly. That's exactly it. That's what I'm trying to do. And that's the sense in which I'm playing dumb, right? I'm forgetting everything I know about the Silmarillion and saying, what are we being told? And what we're being told is that there is a language, a secret language, used as the language of Loren's song. We're told that there is a language brought from the far west. A language to which tongue belong most of the names in this history. And a language of the woodland elves. And those seem to map onto the triad of elf peoples, the Vanyar, the Noldor, the Teleri. And okay. So the language of the Noldor is like Gondor and Orodruin and Carathras and all of the names like that. Baranduin, that's Noldor language. The High Elves, the Deep Elves, the Sea Elves. Except they're the Wood Elves in this case. Because they didn't, make it to the sea. But anyway, the three peoples, right? The Telerian. And so, yes, I agree. What is one of the things that interests me, David Michael, about this is that he is not explaining Silmarillion stuff here. And that's really interesting to me because he does in other places. We'll see it happen. Before we get to the end of this, we'll see it happen. But he's not doing it here. He's presenting, again, I shouldn't say dumbed down. That's not a playing dumb or dumbing it down. Neither one of is really appropriate. It doesn't really quite capture what's going on here. But he's giving a version of this that requires no context of history, or not much anyway. Exiles from Elvenhome in the far west requires a little bit of context, right? But, he's pointed. It's certainly simplified, Maureen. Yes. And does not map onto what he will later say and what we will be what we modern readers will later bring to the text. Quenya, Sindarin, Sylvan, right? It's still shifting about how this is going to work. So apparently when he wrote this, the language which we know as Sindarin was the language of the Noldor. I keep saying it because I'm like trying to get that in I'm trying to reorient, even if just for now, my own head in that direction, because that's so counterintuitive. But that is what he's saying here. David Michael, this was written after he's done writing The Lord of the Rings. This was written, Christopher believes, at about the same time that the last prologue was written, namely when he had finished the drafting of The Lord of the Rings and was revising the final proofs and such. So it's not a long time before the matter of Appendix A and B. Similar time. We haven't gotten to that stuff yet, but yeah, 48, 49, that's around the late 40s is most likely when he's writing this. Okay. All right. Having gotten over that hurdle, let's move forward. There were also the languages of men when they did not speak the common tongue. Now, those languages of men that are here met with were related to the common speech, for the men of the north and west were akin in the beginning to the men of westerness that came back over the sea. Lots of coming and going across the sea. And the common speech was indeed made by the blending of the speech of the men of Middle-earth with the tongues of the kings from over the sea. But in the north, old forms survived, that is, pre-Númenorian forms survived. The speech of the men of Dale, therefore, to show its relationship, has been cast in a northern form related distantly to the English which has been taken to represent the common speech. While the speech of the men of Rohan, who came out of the north, and still among themselves used their ancestral language, though all their greater folk spoke also the common speech after the manner of their allies in Gondor, I have represented by ancient English, such as it was 1,000 years ago, or as far back from us, about, as was the day of Eorl the Young from Theoden of Rohan. Okay. Did you follow that? Let's break that down. Just make sure that we're tracking here because it's a little complicated. Again, this is not Tolkien at his most lucid because he's sketching pretty quickly, as Christopher told us. All right. Hang on, David. I'm going to come back to the timeline weirdness in just a minute. I think that's evidence for the dating of this, but we'll come back to that in a sec. Okay. First, he's saying two things at once. He is first explaining to us how the languages of men developed. There were languages of men when they did not speak. So there's the common tongue, which he's already introduced. This is the language that the hobbits speak, that noble tongue. And he said, remember that noble tongue, here we go. This noble tongue has spread in the course of time from the kingdoms of Fornost and Gondor. Okay, so it comes from the languages from the Númenorian kingdoms is where the common tongue comes from, right? But he's still enough of a philologist to want to go a little deeper into the history than that, right? So don't forget that the men of Westerness left Middle-earth and went across the sea, and then they came back. When they left and then came back, their language changed while they were away. There were people still left in Middle-earth who were still speaking the languages that the men of Numenor were speaking before, and then took away, and then they changed. So when they come back in the kingdoms of Fornost and Gondor, as he says, the common speech developed as a merging of the newish speech of the altered speech of Numenor and the original speech of the people of Middle-earth, right? Okay, so we've got, and it's like a little bit more complicated than that because not everybody in Middle-earth spoke exactly the same version. So like different places where they spoke the languages of Middle-earth were kind of a little bit different, right? And he is way easily enough of a language geek to really be into that, right? So, okay. So, all right. So he explains that whole situation first. Why do we care? This is why we care. Because again, he's still explaining his methodology, right? You notice how the elf languages were relevant to the methodology as well? That's where the names come from. Those strange foreign sounding names, like some of the random ones I was remembering, right? Gondor, Orodruin, Baranduin, Karathras, things like that, right? Imladris, all of those kinds of names. Those names that sound weird, those are Elvish. That's why you just need to know, right? Those are Noldor names. Trust me. So, but you may notice that certain elements, like the speech of the men of Dale, was a northern form of it's not the same as the common speech. They don't just speak the common speech in Dale. Their language comes from, because they're not Numenorian influenced, right? So their speech comes from the old form. So how does he represent it? Common, he's representing by English. So how does he represent the speech of the men of Dale? Old Norse. That's why there are Nordic names in Dale. Right? Cool. And then there are people who are also from the north, but not from exactly the same place, whose language is similar to the language that's being represented by Old Norse, but it's not exactly the same. Also, and there's Gothic mixed in there too. It's even more complicated. Like the real linguistic situation that he's building is even more complicated than he's letting on here, right? You may remember, the names of like the old kingdom of Rovanian, right? Which he gives Gothic names for this reason. Whatever. Anyway, point is, the speech of the men of Dale, to show its relationship, has been cast in a northern form. That's why you'll see Norse names associated with Dale. Related distantly to English, as indeed Old Norse is related distantly to English. While the speech of the men of Rohan, who came out of the north, I've represented by ancient English, right? They're Old English. Right. Tomas says, that's how you can tell Alfred was a Peter Jackson invention. He would have been Eric or a Hrolf or a Sven had he been a Tolkien character. Exactly. Alfred is an Old English name, not a Nordic name. So that would there might be an Alfred way back in one of the Rohirrim family trees potentially. But anyway, now let me address the issue David Michael has just referred to. He says here, I've represented by ancient English such as it was 1,000 years ago, or as far back from us about as was the day of Eorl the Young from Theoden of Rohan. Now, many people have observed, as David Michael was observing, according to Appendix B, there's only 500 years there. So what does that tell us? This is probably written before he wrote Appendix B. He probably hasn't worked out the dates yet. So he says, estimating, I believe Tolkien was way too detail oriented to wave his hands at 500 years and call it about 1,000 years ago. Like, I don't think he would do that. I think he's calling it, I think he's calling it 1,000 years ago because he hasn't worked out the dates yet. He hasn't worked out the times. Yeah. So okay. Anyway, so that's interesting. This suggests to me he has not yet written. And since there are things in Appendix A which suggest that he's done Appendix B first, we'll get to more of that stuff later. I think he's done this before he's done either of those, really. Worked all that stuff out. The orcs and goblins had languages of their own, as hideous as all things that they made or used, and since some remnant of goodwill and true thought and perception is required to keep even a base language alive and useful even for base purposes, their tongues were endlessly diversified in form, as they were deadly monotonous in purport, fluent only in the expression of abuse, of hatred, and fear. For which reason they and their kind used and still use the languages of nobler creatures in such intercourse as they must have between tribe and tribe. Christopher's note, right? He says, my father was asserting, I think, that a language so base and narrow in thought and expression cannot remain a common tongue of widespread use, for from its very inadequacy it cannot resist change of form and must become a mass of closed jargons incomprehensible even to others of the same kind. Yes, I do think, I certainly agree with Christopher. I think that that's what Tolkien was saying, though I think he's also saying a bit more than that. And I think this is why he uses, we 21st century readers are likely to be triggered by some of Tolkien's language here, such as the languages of nobler creatures. Do you see what I mean? Like that makes us uncomfortable. Modern us. Tolkien would not have been uncomfortable with that. Would not have been uncomfortable saying that humans and elves and dwarves were more noble creatures than elves were. And that there is a moral, and his use of the word base, right? His use of the word, again, that would, I think, make many modern people uncomfortable. That kind of a value assessment of a whole race of people is something that makes 21st century people uncomfortable. Tolkien openly speaks of the orcs as having a base language being used for base purposes. And he does attribute their lack of goodwill and true thought and perception. Their whole intellectual and moral apparatus is stunted by their by their baseness, by the fact that they use language only for expressions of abuse, hatred, and fear. Anyone who uses their language, whose language is fluent only in the expression of abuse, hatred, and fear, if that's all you do with your language, you cannot think clearly. You cannot perceive clearly. You cannot think and perceive clearly if the language you use, if your language, if your native idiom is fluent only in the expression of abuse, of hatred, and of fear. I think he's pointing here to a connection between articulation and thought. If you don't have the words for it, you're not going to be able to think it. And if the only language you know and have taught and have been taught and use is a language of abuse, hatred, and fear, you're not even going to be able to conceive of kindness and generosity and love and bravery. It's going to be outside of your entire mental landscape because you don't even have building block concepts for that. In order to maintain a language, to keep a language alive and useful, you need some goodwill, he says. You can't just be using it as expressions of abuse, of hatred, and fear. And I think, as is often the case, I hear in every reference that Tolkien makes to orc speech, I hear sometimes an explicit and in the rest of the times an implicit warning or caution about our own language and our own choices. Should we let our own spoken language become fluent only in expressions of abuse, hatred, and fear, we too will cease. Our own faculties for true thought and perception and even goodwill will atrophy with that language. Again, as I say, it's an application that Tolkien seems to invite every time he talks about orc speech. And I think that I think that we can hear that here as well. Notice, by the way, there is no hint. We've already heard in the Tree of Tongues about where the black speech came from. We've gotten already in Silmarillion materials stories of the invention of black speech by Sauron. Notice he makes no gesture at that here. The idea of black speech is a kind of failed independent language, conlanged by Sauron. Not even a vague gesture at that, which is really interesting. Okay, running out of time. Continuing through. The dwarves are a different case. They are a hard-thrown folk, for the most part, secretive, acquisitive, laborious, retentive of the memory of injuries and of benefits, lovers of stone, of metals, of gems, of things that grow and take shape under the hands of craft, rather than of things that live by their own life. But they are not and were not ever among the workers of willful evil in the world, nor servants of the enemy. Whatever the tales of men may later have said of them, love that so much. For men have lusted after the works of their hands, and there has been enmity between the races. But it is according to the nature of the dwarves that the travelling and labouring and trading about the world they should use ever openly. Hang on a second, I lost my place. But I lost the syntax. But it is according to the nature of the dwarves that travelling and labouring and trading about the world, they should use ever openly the languages of the men among whom they dwell, and yet in secret, a secret which, unlike the elves, they are unwilling to unlock even to those whom they know are friends and desire learning, not power. They use a strange, slow-changing tongue. Little is known about it. So it is that here such dwarves as appear have names of the same northern kind as the men of Dale that dwelt round about, and speak the common speech. Now in this manner, now in that, and only in a few names do we get any glimpse of their hidden tongue. Okay. Couple things are really fast. First, I love the retcon. Did you catch the retcon? They are not and were not ever among the workers of willful evil in the world, nor servants of the enemy. Anyone who says that they are must be speaking with the tongues of Melkor, I think. Anyway, whatever the tales of men may later have said of them. What's he referring to? He's referring to his own early writings, right? Which is awesome. And which And it's especially funny because like it's awesome because we've read them, right? We read it in Book of Lost Tales and in the Shaping of Middle Earth, right? But when he was writing this for publication with The Lord of the Rings, who had read those? Almost no one. So what he's referring to, it does work as retcon for his own work. But he's also talking about fairy tales. There are lots of stories about evil dwarves out there. I mean, you have to admit that, like, the story of the Nibelungs is not real kind to dwarves. Right? Really fun. Here's another interesting thing. I'm not going to go too deep into these waters because there's a lot here. And it's complicated. This is a whole rabbit hole. And I'm not going to go deep down the rabbit hole. But let me just peek into it for a second. Many are the connections, sometimes made by Tolkien himself, sometimes made by others, between the dwarves and Jews. Notice two things. First of all, his description in that second sentence of the dwarves does not utilize traditional anti-Semitic stereotypes. So, Arthur, no, don't worry, Arthur. I said I'm peeking down the rabbit hole because this is a topic of conversation, and I want to address it. And I think there's an interesting thing to be seen here, and that is what I'm alluding to is there are lots of people who have a kind of a simplistic idea of this. Basically, that Tolkien had these kind of anti-Semitic, that he was sort of freely recycling anti-Semitic language and concepts, and applying them to the dwarves in what he thought was kind of a comical manner. And there are many people who read Tolkien kind of simplistically that way. One of the things I'm wanting to do, Arthur, is object to that simplified reading here. So the first thing I want to point out is one would not read that very full description of the character and culture of the dwarves that we get in that second paragraph with its long lists and everything. If you had never heard this connection, if you knew nothing at all about this whole rabbit hole and discussion that has been happening for decades about anti-Semitism in Tolkien's dwarves, you wouldn't guess it from that sentence. That's the point, right? So that's my first point. Here, Arthur, this is the thing that I find really interesting about it. About this paragraph. Look where he goes. So, who is it who says evil things about the dwarves? There are men who tell scurrilous tales, untrue stories about the dwarves, which paint them as bad guys. And why do they do this? Because men have lusted after the work of their hands and there's been enmity between the races. It's because of old enmity and racial hatreds that these traditions have grown. In fact, the way that he talks about the anti-dwarf rhetoric of many fairy tales almost sounds like how anti-Semitic stories grew in the Middle Ages. Like the medieval traditions of Jews poisoning wells and that kind of thing. Not because there was basis in it, but because there was enmity. Anyway, I just, that parallel strikes me as really, really interesting. I'm not saying that Tolkien is addressing the anti-Semitism issue explicitly in this paragraph. He's not. But it's very interesting to me that he characterizes it this way. One of the explicit purposes of this paragraph in introducing the dwarves is to say, if you know bad stories about them, if you've heard anti-dwarf stories, they're lies and exaggerations. That is not fair to the dwarves. And I think that's it's fascinating to me. Again, I don't think that his purpose is to say to be explicitly trying to distance the dwarves from the Jews. I do think that he is trying to distance his dwarves from any of the negative rhetoric which he himself has used. Arthur, as you said, in The Hobbit, he alludes to the fact that people have negative assumptions about dwarves. Dwarves are not heroes. Remember that? But that stuff, he says, is totally unfair. This paragraph sits squarely in Dwarves 4.0. The dwarves are a noble people, lovers of stone, of metals, of gems, of things that grow and take shape under the hands of craft, rather than of things that live by their own life. So cool. He's building them up and saying anything that you've heard anyone, like as it might be me, say anything negative about dwarves, forget it. Forget it. And anything that any negative things people said about dwarves, we're all maliciously motivated. Yeah. And it is also retcon. So he wasn't the original propagator of all the stories. Again, Jocelyn, some of the stories he's referring to that men have, the tales of men from later on, include things like the Nibelungenlied, right? And lots of fairy tales, right? How many fairy tales involve like wicked dwarves? Lots. Bunches of wicked dwarves in fairy tales. Dwarves are usually wicked in fairy tales. So he's talking about that also. Yeah. Anyway, yes. Okay. Closing rabbit hole, right? I'm now backing away from the rabbit hole. Not going to get into the whole deeper discussion. But I wanted to acknowledge it there. Okay. I love this passage about the scripts. And as for the scripts, something must be said of them, since in this history there are both inscriptions and old books, such as the torn remnants of the Book of Mizarble, that must be read. Did you catch that? That must be read. So notice, by the way, he's assuming, or maybe hoping, that his Book of Mizarble illustrations are going to be included in The Lord of the Rings. As Christopher points out in his notes, he always was bitterly disappointed that never happened. But anyway, notice the word that jumps out at me in that first paragraph is must. There are inscriptions that must be read. I mean, yeah, they have to. This is not optional, people. Remember I said like that spectrum between nobody but me will be interested in the languages and some people will be fascinated, right? Notice he's establishing a new baseline here, right? So you will have noticed that there are strange scripts and alphabets and runes and things used in the book, right? So they have to be read. Fencing Frog, I agree. He's almost begging, right? I mean, this is, okay. Enough of them will appear in this book to allow, maybe, the skilled in such matters to decipher both runes and running hands. That is, script. But others may wish for a clearer key. For them, the Elvish script, in its more formal shape as it was used in Gondor for the common speech, is set out in full, though its various modifications used in writing other tongues, especially the High Elven or the Noldoran, must be passed over. I'm not going to tell you how to do Sindarin mode and, Quenya mode and all that stuff. Another script plays a part both in the previous account and the present one, the runes. These also, as most other things of the kind, were also an Elvish invention. But whereas the flowing script of two kinds, the alphabet of Rúmil and the alphabet of Feanor, only the latter of which concerns this tale, were developed in Elvenhome far from Middle-earth. Notice he's getting carried away with Rúmil and Feanor there. The runes, or Cirth, were devised by the elves of the woods, and from that origin derive their peculiar character, similar to the runes of the north in our days, though their detail is different, and it is very doubtful if there is any lineal connection between the two alphabets. So just because the Cirth kind of look like Norse or, Old English runes, it's not. They don't come from the same place, but they are kind of similar because they were devised under similar circumstances. The Elvish Cirth are in any case more elaborate and numerous and systematic. The dwarves devised no letters, and though they used such writing as they found current for necessary purposes, they wrote few books, except brief chronicles, which they kept secret. Oh man. So he can't help himself. We've talked at several points in exploring the Lord of the Rings, like when we were talking about the Book of Mizarbil, slightly less recently, when we were looking at the inscriptions on the tomb of Balin, or on the door, right, the west gate of Moria. You can see Tolkien is so clearly embedding Rosetta Stones wherever he can, right? He issues so many very sometimes gentle, often gentle invitations to his readers to do that thing that I never bothered to do when I was a kid, and that is to figure it out, to decipher the scripts, to decipher the languages, right? So here we can see that invitation is, well, it's not that it's less gentle, but it's certainly more direct, right? And he is indeed assuming that you may have some interest in this. So I'm gonna give you a full key to the Elvish script, Tengwar, that is, of course. More. Okay, it comes back to Gnomish here. The word Gnomish is used above, and it would be an apt name, since whatever Paracelsus may have thought, if indeed he invented the word, to the learned it suggests knowledge. Paracelsus first used the word gnome, and he was talking about like subterranean creatures. And this is Tolkien politely saying Paracelsus was an idiot and doesn't know what he's talking about. To the learned, the word gnomish suggests language because gnome, it means language. Like the word Gnostic, right? It comes from the same root. Anyway, and their own true name in High Elven is Noldor, those that know. For of the three kindreds of the elves, in the beginning, ever the Noldor were distinguished, both by their knowledge of things that are and were in this world, and by the desire to know yet more. Yet they were not in fact in any way like to the gnomes of our learned theory, that is, good old Paracelsus, still less to the gnomes of popular fancy, in which they have been confused with dwarves and goblins and other small creatures of the earth. So if it's in a pointy hat, no, it's confusion. They belonged, that is the gnomes, the actual gnomes, the real gnomes, the Noldor, they belonged to a race high and beautiful, the elder children of the world, who now are gone. Tall they were, fair-skinned and grey-eyed, though their locks were dark, and their voices knew more melodies than any mortal speech that now is heard. Valiant they were, and their history was lamentable, And though a little of it was woven with the fates of the fathers of men in the elder days, their fate is not our fate, and their lives and the lives of men cross seldom. By the end of this paragraph, he's gotten into full-blown teaser for the Silmarillion mode, right? Like, surely he's like, he doesn't explicitly add at the end of this paragraph, if you would like to learn more about these wonderful people and their amazing stories, please direct your inquiries to Allen and Unwin Publishers and ask if they might possibly be willing to publish something that would, right? I mean, it is beautiful, Jackie. And he doesn't explicitly say that, right? But it feels to me pretty clearly that he's going here. But here's the thing that I found most puzzling about this paragraph. Play this game with me for a second. If we just read the last three sentences, right? They belong to a race high and beautiful, the elder children of the world who now are gone. Tall they were, fair-skinned and grey-eyed, though their locks were dark, and their voices knew more melodies than any mortal speech. Valiant they were, and their history was lamentable. Okay, so I read you those three sentences. Very beautiful. And then I asked you the question, what word, still in common modern usage, but whose modern usage Tolkien objected to, and whose modern associations he's trying to change, is he addressing in this paragraph? You would probably have said elf, right? It sounds like he's trying to address the way that the word elf was used and is still used, especially in modern England. That is to say, things are still called an elf thing or a fairy thing, if you mean like a cute wee little thing, right? We don't really use the word elfin in that same way in America. I mean, unless we're quoting an explicitly British phrase, basically. But in any case, so it's fascinating to me that he goes into that, and he never says the word, okay, he says the word elves once. 3 kindreds of the elves in the beginning. But he doesn't address it. It's like he addresses it without even, he's like, I am so going to alter the use of the word elf that I'm not even going to talk about that. I was going to talk about gnomes instead, which is clearly of secondary importance compared to the greater significance of changing what the word elf means. So it's just, this whole approach is really, it's like he is so going for broke on changing elves that he's taking that for granted. And he's going after gnome explicitly, right? Which is a really cool approach. And by the way, if you would like to know more about the lamentable history of the elves, speak to my publisher and tell him to stop thwarting me. Oh, the irony to come in history. Anyway, it will be noted also that in this book, as before, dwarves are spoken of, although dictionaries tell us that the plural of dwarf is dwarfs. It should, of course, be dwarros, meaning that if each singular and plural had gone its own natural way down the years, unaffected by forgetfulness, as man and men have, then dwarf and dwarros we should have said as surely as we say goose and geese. But we do not talk about dwarf as often as we talk of man, or even goose. And memories are not good enough among men to keep hold of a special plural for a race now relegated, such is their fate and the fall of their great pride, to folk tales, where at least some shadow of the truth is preserved, or at last to nonsense tales, where they have become mere figures of fun who do not wash their hands. But here something of their old character and power, if already diminished, is still glimpsed. These are the Nauglir of old, in whose hearts still smouldered the ancient fires and the embers of their grudge against the elves. Take that, Disney, says Fencing Frog. Yeah. Am I right in thinking mere figures of fun who do not wash their hands is an actual reference to Snow White? Right? I mean, I'm not making a mistake about that, right? That's actually explicitly a direct reference to Snow White. Disney's Snow White, I mean. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. So the final degradation of dwarves is Snow White, is Disney. Right? Yeah. But here, something of their old character and power is still glimpsed. But notice how he still operates within the historical frame. Such is their fate and the fall of their great pride. Why is it that we don't talk about dwarves as often as we talk about man or about goose? Well, look, if the dwarves don't get a lot of press, they have nobody to blame but themselves, because they're all secretive, right? He's already talked about how the dwarves kept to themselves and didn't share things. And yeah, I think that's what he means by the fall of their great pride. Because they kept aloof and secretive, they were forgotten by men. And since they were forgotten by men, they became relegated to folk tales, and at last to nonsense tales like Disney movies. And so, we have forgotten how to correctly pluralize dwarf. Not that it should be dwarves, but it should be dwarros. He segues from here. I artificially cut this paragraph in half, not only in half the paragraph, but in half that sentence. It ends with a semicolon. These are the Nauglir of old, in whose hearts still smoldered the ancient fires and the embers of their grudge against the elves. And to mark this, dwarves is used, in defiance of correctness and the dictionaries, although actually it is derived from no more learned source than childhood habit. I shifted here to a separate slide because I wanted to focus on Tolkien's discussion and revelations of his own personal preferences. I always had a love of the plurals that did not go according to the simplest rule. Loaves and elves and wolves and leaves and wreaths and houses, which I should have liked better, spelt wreaths, R-E-A-T-H-E-S, and houses, H-O-U-Z-E-S. What do you think, by the way, people? Should we try to start a revolution and start using Z in houses? You see what he's talking about, right? House and houses, the vowel does change, just like wolf and wolves. But we still use an S because you can pronounce S voiced or unvoiced in modern English. So we don't need to use the Z, but I don't know. You want to have a go? House and houses with a Z? Anyway, and then he adds, and I persist in hooves and roofs according to ancient authority. I have said, therefore, dwarves, however I might see it spelt, feeling that the good folk were a little dignified so. For I never believed the sillier things about them that were presented to my notice. Like in cinemas, for instance. I wish I had known of dwarros in those days. I should have liked it better still. Delightful. The purpose of the extra E in wreaths is it's what he's emphasizing is the change of the vowel. One wreath, unvoiced th at the end, and two wreaths with a voiced th at the end. So just as wolf, loaf, elf, and wreath and house, and roof and hoof, right, all end with an unvoiced consonant, it changes to its voiced version when you make it plural. And that's what he says that he loves. It's the change in the consonant that he loves. And so with houses, there's another consonant he can use, the Z, right? There's no other way to write TH. Voiced TH and unvoiced TH look the same, but he's thinking by adding the E to emphasize that. I'm not sure that it would work. I think if you wrote it with an E, people wouldn't get what you were emphasizing exactly, but I see what he's getting at. I love the idea that he thinks that the special plural, not just tagging an S on the end, but the special plural dignifies the good people, the dwarves, a little bit. And I like even more that he wanted to do that. The good people, right? Again, he's still the good folk. He's trying to recover their reputation here. I have enshrined it now at any rate, Dwaro, that is, Dwaros, in my translation of the name of Moria in the common speech, which meant the dwarf delving, and that I have rendered by the Dwaro delf. But Moria itself is an elvish name of gnomish kind, given without love, for the true gnomes, though they might here and there in the bitter wars against the enemy and his orc servants make great fortresses beneath the earth, were not dwellers in caves or tunnels of choice, but lovers of the green earth and of the lights of heaven, and Moria in their tongue means the black chasm. Here he is Rosetta Stoning again. But the dwarves themselves, and this name at any rate was never secret, called it simply Khazad-dûm, the mansion of the Khazad, for such is their own name for their own race, and has been so since their birth in the deeps of time. Yes, JJ, I think there's a deliberate echo. JJ is saying it's the elevating dwarves to equality with elves. Still, elves were and remain. Elves they were and remain, and that is good people, said Tolkien of the Wood Elves in The Hobbit, right? Elves are good people, capital G, capital P. And yes, JJ, I cannot believe that when he says, feeling that the good folk were a little dignified so, I don't believe that he was not thinking of that line when he wrote that. I think he totally was. Okay. Let me move ahead. I'm almost done. Christopher's assessment. The opening remarks of this text certainly suggest that the narrative of The Lord of the Rings had been completed, and this in turn suggests that it was not far removed in time from the renewed work on the foreword concerning hobbits, i.e. the prologue. Though it is not much more than a guess, I incline to think that when my father began it, he intended it as a personal and dedicatory preface, entirely distinct in nature from the account of the hobbits, which was a prologue expressly relating to the narrative. So does this. But that involuntarily he was soon swept into writing about those matters of languages and scripts that he felt needed some introduction and explanation at least as much as did the hobbits. The result was, clearly, a combination wholly unsuitable to his purpose, and he put it aside. I would also guess that it was the writing of this text that gave rise to the idea of a special appendix on languages and scripts, ultimately divided into two, and this is why I place it at the beginning of this account of the evolution of what came to be Appendix F, the languages and peoples of the Third Age. Since I shall number the text of this appendix from F1, it is convenient to call this anomalous forward F star. Okay, so see, once again, Christopher is missing the point, or missing the frame, the fact that it is a frame. I incline to think that when my father began it, he intended it as a personal and dedicatory preface. No, it's not personal. It's in a persona. Again, that's muddied by the fact that he alludes to the Inklings and talks about his children in those first three paragraphs, right? But it's not personal in that he isn't actually translating a text from Westron. That's not true personal history. That's frame. That's a fictional persona and a fictional occasion. And it's not actually from the great book of Samwise, right? Great book chock full of Samwise. which was a prologue expressly relating to the narrative. Again, so yes, he's swept into writing about the matters of languages and script he felt needed some introduction, but not in his own voice, in the voice of the narrator. And again, it fits because it's part of the scholarly both of them. The other prologue and this are part of the scholarly apparatus. Two more short points, and then we're done. I have supplemented the account of the Red Book in places. This is from Tolkien's first edition prologue, or forward, rather, to the Lord of the Rings, first edition forward. I have supplemented the account of the Red Book in places with information derived from the surviving records of Gondor, notably the Book of the Kings. But in general, though I have omitted much, I have in this tale adhered more closely to the actual words and narrative of my original. And by my original, he means that's the way that scholars refer to the thing I'm translating, right? His original is the original text. The translation is what we're reading, right? I have adhered more closely to the actual words and narrative of my original than in the previous selection from the Red Book, The Hobbit. The Hobbit is a way looser translation. That was drawn from the early chapters, composed originally by Bilbo himself, if composed is a just word. Bilbo was not assiduous, nor an orderly narrator, and his account is involved and discursive, and sometimes confused. Faults that still appear in the Red Book, since the copiers were pious and careful and altered very little. Pious meaning devoted to Bilbo's words, right? So first of all, we can see here again how he is explaining the tonal differences between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. This in the foreword to the first edition of the Lord of the Rings, saying, hey, yeah, you'll notice the difference in tone. And that's because The Hobbit is frankly a mess, right? And in that book, I deviated from the original far more. I took liberties with the original in The Hobbit for reasons. I wanted to make it a kid's book, right? Sue me. But this book is the real article. This is a much more faithful translation than The Hobbit was. Right, so he puts the shift of tone into that context. But notice the other thing about this. He is in this forward also speaking within that same fictional persona framework as he was in both of those prologue materials, both of the prologue materials that Christopher is confused by. He's quite consistent with it. My original, again, he's referring to the thing he's translating, which is not actually what happened. It's fake. But again, that's the thing that Christopher just seems to be overlooking, just seems to be kind of taking it for, I think it's like so big that Christopher's not noticing it, if you see what I mean. Like he's looking past that. A final note on it. In the second edition of 1966, this forward, that is the first edition forward, was rejected in its entirety. On one of his copies of the first edition, my father wrote beside it, "This forward I should wish very much in any case to cancel. Confusing as it does real personal matters with the machinery of the tale is a serious mistake." And there it is. In that, if you remember, Christopher gives the full text of the original forward, or much of it. He goes on from this part, the part where he's talking about, where he's dissing on Bilbo, right? And what an unassiduous narrator he was. He segues from this into talking about how long it took him to write and how he had to set it aside for a year and how busy he was and everything, right? So that is, he, again, in his first edition forward, muddied the waters between the fictional frame on the one hand, which is clearly evident here, and his actual autobiography stuff, right? And he, when going back and reading it, he acknowledged it and says, yeah, I got to stop doing that. I've got to stop doing that. I can't confuse real personal matters, that is actual autobiography, and the machinery of the tale is what he's doing. The machinery of the tale is the frames. That's the machinery. So in the second edition, what happens? The foreword is where the real personal matters are, where he addresses the, like, I have cordially disliked allegory and all that stuff, right? The new second edition foreword. That's in his own voice. That's personal matter. Or to speak of a less grievous matter, right? He's talking, by 1918, all but one of my closest friends were dead, right? Personal matters in that foreword. Then you turn the page. Prologue, concerning hobbits. And now it's the machinery of the tale, consistently, all the way through from there. It's the frame. See what I mean? Okay. So there we go. We got 10 pages into I still encourage you to read all of the second chapter for next time, because you never know. There's more notes in the next part, and so I might jump around a little bit more as we look at the evolution of Appendix F. I may do a more sort of survey thing like I did with the prologue. So do read to the end of the next chapter, but no promises. We'll see how we do. All right. Thanks, everybody. I did want to say before we go, I'm not going to be around next week. I'm not going to be available next week. So we won't meet next week, but we'll meet the week after that. Okay. So 2 weeks from tonight, on the 24th of July, we shall return and talk about the rest of chapter 2. All right. Thanks very much, everybody. See you in a fortnight. Bye now.